At the threshold of the Vedic literature, we meet with an elaborately organized sacrificial system so well regulated by the luni-solar calendar as to show that the Vedic bards had, by that time, attained considerable proficiency in practical astronomy. There were daily, fortnightly, monthly, quarterly, half-yearly, and yearly sacrifices, which, as shown elsewhere, have also served as chronometers in those days. The Taittirîya Samhitâ of the Brahmanas distinctly mentions a lunar month of 30 days and a year of 12 such months, to which an intercalary month was now and then added, to make the lunar and solar year correspond with each other. The ecliptic, or belt of the zodiac, was divided into 27 of 28 divisions, called the nakshastras, which were used as milestones to mark the annual passage of the sun or the monthly revolution of the moon around the earth. The 2 solstitial and 2 equinoctial points, as well as the passage of the sun into the northern and the southern hemisphere, were clearly distinguished, and the year was divided into 6 seasons, the festivals in each month or the year being accurately fixed and ascertained. The stars rising and setting with the sun were also systematically observed, and the eastern and western points of the compass determined as accurately as the astronomical observations of the day could permit. In the book Orion, or the Antiquity of the Vedas, is shown how the changes in the position of the equinoxes were also marked in these days, and how they enable us to classify the periods of Vedic antiquity. According to this classification, the Taittirîya Samhitâ comes under the Kritya period, about 2500 BC, and some may therefore think that the details of the Vedic calendar given above are peculiar only to the latter Vedic literature. A cursory study of the Rig-Veda will, however, show that such is not the case. A year of 360 days, an intercalary month occasionally added, or a year of 12 lunar months with 12 intercalary days inserted at the end of each year, was familiar to the poets of the Rig-Veda and is often mentioned in the hymns. The northern and southern passage of the sun from equinox to equinox, the Devayâna and the Pitriyâna, together with the yearly satras, have also been referred to in several places, clearly showing that the Rigvedic calendar differed, if at all, very little from the one in use at the time of the Taittirîya Samhitâ or the Brahmanas. A calendar of 12 months of 6 seasons is peculiar only to the temperate or tropical zone, and if we were to judge only from the facts stated above, it follows that the people who used such a calendar must have lived in places where the sun was above the horizon during all the days of the year. The science of Vedic mythology, so far as it is developed at present, also supports the same view. Vitra, said to be a demon of drought or darkness, and several myths are explained on the theory that they represent a daily struggle between the powers of light and the powers of darkness, or the eventual triumph of summer over winter, or day over night, or Indra over watertight clouds. There has been some attempt to explain these myths on the astral theory, showing that the myths point out the position of the vernal equinox in Orion, in the oldest period of Vedic civilization. But all these theories or methods of interpretation assume that the Vedic people have always been the inhabitants of the temperate or tropical zone, and all these myths and traditions were formed or developed in such a home. Such are the results of researches in Vedic philology, mythology, or calendars regarding the ancient home of the Vedic people and the origin and the antiquity of their mythology. But to one who is working in the same field, the question whether we have reached the utmost limit of our researches naturally occurs. It's a mistake to suppose that all the traditions and myths, and even the deities mentioned in the Rig-Veda, were the creation of one period. To adopt a geological phrase, the Rig-Veda, or we might even say the whole of Vedic literature, is not arranged into different strata, according to their chronological order, so that we can go on from one stratum to another and examine each separately. The Rig-Veda is a book in which old things of different periods are so mixed up that we have to work long and patiently before we're able to separate and classify our contents in chronological order. As stated before, owing to our imperfect knowledge of the ancient man and his surroundings, this task is rendered difficult, or even impossible in some cases. But as observed by Professor Max Mueller, it is the duty of each generation of Vedic scholars to reduce as much as possible the unintelligible portion of the Rig-Veda, so that, with the advance of knowledge, each succeeding generation may, in this matter, naturally be in a better position than its predecessors. The Vedic calendar, so far as we know, or the Vedic mythology, may not have as yet disclosed any indication of an Arctic home, but underneath the materials which have been examined, or even by their side, we may still find facts which, though hitherto neglected, may, in the new light of scientific discoveries, lead to important conclusions. The mention of the luni-solar calendar of the Rig-Veda ought not, therefore, to detain us from further pursuing our investigation by examining the texts and legends, which have not as yet been satisfactorily explained, and ascertaining how far such texts and legends indicate the existence of a polar or circumpolar home in early times. The distinguishing characteristics of these regions have been already discussed and stated, and all we have now to do is to apply these tests and decide if they're satisfied or fulfilled by the texts and legends under consideration. Spinning round the heavenly dome overhead is one of the special characteristics of the North Pole, and the phenomenon is so peculiar that one may expect to find traces of it in the early traditions of a people, if they, or their ancestors, have ever lived near the North Pole. Applying this test to the Vedic literature, we do find passages which compare the motion of the heavens as to that of a wheel, and state that the celestial vault is supported as if on an axis. Thus, in Rig-Veda 10:89-4, Indra is said to separately uphold by his power heaven and earth, as the two wheels of a chariot are held by the axle. Professor Ludwig thinks that this refers to the axis of the Earth, and the explanation is very probable. The same idea occurs in other places. Sometimes the sky is described as being supported even without a pole, testifying thereby that it is the great power or might of Indra. Indra is identified with Sûrya, and he's described as turning the widest expanse like the wheels of a chariot. The word used here for expanse is Varamsis, which Sanya understood to mean lights or stars. But whichever meaning we adopt, it is clear that the verse in question refers to the revolution of the sky and compares the motion of a chariot wheel. Now, the heaven in the temperate or tropical regions may be described as moving like a wheel from east to west and then back again to the east, though the latter half of the circuit is not visible to the observer. But we cannot simply speak of the tropical sky as being supported on a pole, for the simple reason that the North Pole, which must be the point of support in such case, will not be sufficiently near the zenith in the tropical or temperate zone. If we therefore combine the two statements, that the heavens are supported as on a pole and that they move like a wheel, we may safely infer that the motion referred to is the motion of the celestial hemisphere, as can be witnessed only by an observer at the North Pole. In Rig-Veda 1:24-10, the constellation of Ursa Major, Riksha, is described as being placed high, and that this can only refer to the altitude of the constellation. It follows then that it must have been overhead of the observer, which is possible only in the circumpolar regions. As a side note, it may also be remarked in this connection that the passage speaks of the appearance, not the rising of the seven bears at night, and their disappearance, but not setting, during the day, showing that the constellation was circumpolar at the place of the observer. Unfortunately, there are few other passages in the Rig-Veda which describe the motion of the celestial hemisphere or of the stars therein, and we must therefore take up another characteristic of the polar regions, namely a day and a night of 6 months each, and see if the Vedic literature contains any references to this singular feature of the polar regions. The idea that the day and the night of the gods are each of 6 months' duration is so widespread in the Indian literature that we examine it here at some length and, for that purpose, commence with post-Vedic literature and trace it back to the most ancient books. It is found not only in the Puranas, but also in the astronomical works, and the latter state in its more definite form we shall begin in the later Siddhântas. Mount Meru is the terrestrial north pole of our astronomers, and in the Sûrya Siddhânta 1267 says, "At Meru, gods behold the sun after but a single rising, during the half of his revolution beginning with Aries." Now, according to the Puranas, Meru is the home or seat of all the gods, and the statement about their half-year-long night and day is thus easily and naturally explained, and all astronomers and diviners have accepted the accuracy of the explanation. The day of the gods corresponds with the passage of the sun from the vernal to the autumnal equinox, when the sun is visible at the North Pole or the Meru, and the night with the southern passage of the sun or the autumnal back to vernal equinox. But Bhaskaracharya, not properly understanding the passage which states that Uttarayana is the day of the gods, has raised the question how Uttarayana, which in his day meant the passage of the sun from the winter to the summer solstice, could be the day of the gods stationed at the North Pole, for an observer at the pole can only see the sun in his passage from the vernal to the autumnal equinox. But as shown elsewhere here, Bhaskaracharya has here fallen into error by attributing the word Uttarayana, a sense which it did not bear in the old times, or at least in the passages embodying this transition. The old meaning of Uttarayana, literally the northern passage of the sun, was the period of time required by the sun to travel from the vernal to the autumnal equinox, or the portion of the ecliptic in the northern hemisphere. And if we understand the word in this sense, the statement that the Uttarayana is the day of the Devas is at once plain and also unintelligible. Bhaskaracharya's reference to the oldest astronomical Samhitâs clearly shows the tradition was handed down from the oldest times. It is suggested that in these passages, gods may mean apotheosized ancestors of the human race, but I do not think that we need any such explanation. If the ancestors of the human race ever lived at the North Pole, so must have their gods. And we shall show in a subsequent chapter that the Vedic deities are, as a matter of fact, clothed with attributes which are distinctly polar in origin. It makes therefore no difference of our purpose if the striking feature of the primitive home is traditionally preserved or remembered as characteristics of the gods or of the apotheosized ancestors of the race. We're concerned with the tradition itself, and our object is pained if its existence is clearly established. The next authority for the statement is Manu 1:67. While describing the division of times, it says, "A year, human, is a day and a night of the gods, and thus are the two divided. The northern passage of the sun is the day, and the southern is the night." The day and the night of the gods are then taken as a unit for measuring longer periods of time as the kalpas and so on, and of the Nashka's Nirukta 14:4 probably contains the same reference. Muir, in the first volume of his original Sanskrit texts, gives some of these passages so far as they bear on the yuga system found in the Puranas, but we are not concerned with the later development of the idea that the day and the night of the gods each lasted for 6 months. What is important from our point of view is the persistent prevalence of this tradition in the Vedic and post-Vedic literature, which can only be explained on the hypothesis that originally it must have been the result of actual observation. We shall, therefore, next quote Mahabharata, which gives such a clear description of Mount Meru, the Lord of the Mountains, as to leave no doubt at its being the North Pole, or possessive of the polar characteristics. In chapter 163 and 164 of the Vana, Arjuna's visit to the mount is described in detail, and we are therein told, "At Meru, The sun and moon go round from left to right every day, and so do all the stars. Later on, the writer informs us, the mountain, by its luster, so overcomes the darkness of night, that the night can hardly be distinguished from the day. A few verses further in, and we find, the day and night are together equal to a year to the residents of the place. These quotations are quite sufficient to convince anyone that, at the time when the great epic was composed, Indian writers had a tolerably accurate knowledge of the meteorological and astronomical characteristics of the North Pole, and this knowledge cannot be supposed to have been acquired by mere mathematical calculations. The reference to the luster of the mountain is specifically interesting, inasmuch as, in all probability, it is a description of the splendors of the aurora borealis, visible at the North Pole. So far as the post-Vedic literature is concerned, we have therefore not only the tradition of a half-year-long night and day of the gods persistently mentioned, but the Mount Meru, or North Pole, is described with such accuracy as to lead us to believe that it is an ancient tradition whose origin must be traced to a time when these phenomena were daily observed by the people, and this is confirmed by the fact that the tradition is not confined only to post-Vedic literature. Passing on, therefore, to the Vedic literature, we find Mount Meru described as the seat of the 7 Adhyatas in the Taittirîya Brâhmana 171, while the 8th Adhyata, called Kashyapa, is said never to leave the Great Meru, or Maha Meru. Kashyapa is further described as communicating light to the 7 Adityas, and himself perpetually illumining the great mountain. It is, however, in Taittirîya Brâhmana 3:9-22:1 that we meet with a passage which clearly says, "That which is a year is but a single day of the gods." The statement is so clear there can be no doubt whatever about its meaning. A year of the mortals is said to be but a day of the gods, but at one time it was considered extremely hazardous to base any theory upon such a clear statement, inasmuch as it then appeared to me to be but a solitary reference in Vedic literature. Could not then find anything to match it in the Samhitâs, especially in the Rig-Veda, and was inclined to hold that the Uttarayana Dakshinayana were, in all probability, described in this way as day and night with a qualifying word to mark their special nature. Later researches have, however, forced the conclusion that the tradition, represented by this passage, indicates the existence of a polar home in old days, and we have set forth, in the sequel, the evidence on which we've come to the above conclusion. There are several theories on which the statement above, in the Taittirîya Brâhmana, can be explained. We may regard it as the outcome of pure imagination, or of a metaphor, expressing in figurative language a fact quite different from the one denoted by the words used. Or it may be the result of actual observation by the writer himself or by persons from whom he traditionally derived his information. It may also be considered as based on astronomical calculations made in later days, which was originally an astronomical inference, being subsequently converted into real observed fact. The last of these suppositions would have appeared probable if the tradition had been confined to only post-Vedic literature or merely to astronomical works. But we cannot suppose that during the time of the Brahmanas, the astronomical knowledge was so far advanced as to make it possible to fabricate a fact by mathematical calculation, even supposing the Vedic poets were capable of making such a fabrication. Even in the days of Herodotus, the statement that there existed a people who slept for 6 months was regarded as incredible, and we must therefore give up the idea that several centuries before Herodotus, a statement regarding the day and nights of the gods could have been fabricated in the way stated above. But all doubts on the point are set to rest by the occurrence of an almost identical statement in the sacred books of the Parsis. In the Vendidad, Vargad 2, we find the sentence, "They regard as a day what is a year." This is but a paraphrase of the statement in the Taittirîya Brâhmana, and the context in the Parsi scriptures removes all possible doubts regarding the polar character of the statement. The latter part of the second Fargad, wherein the passage occurs, contains a discourse between Ahura Mazda and Yima. Ahura Mazda warns Yima, the first king of men, of the approach of a dire winter, which is to destroy every living creature by covering the land in a thick sheet of ice, and advises Yima to build a Vara, or an enclosure to preserve the seeds of every kind of animal and plant. The meeting is said to have taken place in the Airyana Vaêjo, or the paradise of the Iranians. The Vara, or enclosure advised by Ahura Mazda, is accordingly prepared, and Yima asked Ahura Mazda, "O maker of the material world, thou Holy One, what lights are there to give light to the Vara which Yima made?" Ahura Mazda answered, "There are uncreated lights and created lights. There the star, the moon, and the sun are only once a year seen to rise and set, and a year seems only as a day." I have taken one rendering, but another by Spiegel is substantially the same. The passage is important from various standpoints. First of all, it tells us that the original home of the Iranians was a place which was rendered uninhabitable by glaciation, and secondly, that in this original home the sun rose and set only once in a year, and that the year was like a day to the inhabitants of the place. The bearing of this passage in regard to glaciation will be discussed later on. For the present, it is enough to point out how completely it corroborates and elucidates the statement in the Taittirîya Brâhmana stated and discussed above. The yearly rising and setting of the sun is possible only at the North Pole, and the mention of this characteristic leaves no room for doubting that the Vara and the Airyana Vaêjo were both located in the Arctic or circumpolar regions, and that the passage in the Taittirîya Brâhmana also refers to the polar year. The fact that the statement is found both in the Iranian and Indian literature further negates the probability of its being a fabrication from a mathematical calculation. Nor can we suppose that both the branches of the ancient race became acquainted with this fact simply by an effort of unassisted imagination, or that it is mere metaphor. The only remaining alternative is to hold, as did Sir Charles Lyell, that the tradition was founded on the observation of nature. It is true that the statement, or anything similar to it, is not found in the Rig-Veda, but it was shown later that there are many other passages in the Rig-Veda which go on to corroborate the statement in a remarkable way by referring to other polar characteristics. It may be mentioned here, though, the fact that the oldest Vedic year appears to have been divided into only two portions, the Devayâna and the Pitriyâna, which originally corresponded to the Uttarayana and the Daishinayana, or the day and night of the gods. The word Devayâna occurs several times in the Rig-Veda, Samhitâs, and denotes the path of the gods. Thus, in Rig-Veda 1:72-7, Agni is said to be cognizant of the Devayâna road, and then Rig-Veda 183:6 and 184:6, the poet says, "We have, O Ashvins, reached the end of darkness. Now come to us by the Devayâna road." In 7:76-2, we again read, "The Devayâna road has become visible to me. The banner of the dawn has appeared in the east." Passages like these clearly indicate that the road of the Devayâna commenced with the rise of dawn, and after the end of darkness, and that it was the road on which Agni, Ashvins, Ushas, Sûrya, and other matutinal deities traveled during their heavenly course. The path of the Pitris, or Pitriyâna, is on the other hand described in 10:18:1 as the reverse of the Devayâna, or the path of death. In Rig-Veda 10:88-15, the poet says that he has heard of only two roads, one of the Devas and the other of the Pitris. The Devayâna therefore commenced with the dawn. We must suppose that the Pitriyâna commenced with the advent of darkness. Sayana is therefore correct in interpreting Rig-Veda 5:77-2 as stating that the evening is not for the gods. Now, if the Devayâna and the Pitriyâna were only synonyms of ordinary day and night, there was obviously no propriety in stating that these were the only two paths or roads known to the ancient rishis, and could not have been described as consisting of 3 seasons each, beginning with the spring. It seems therefore very probable that the Devayâna and the Pitriyâna originally represented a twofold division of the year, one of continuous light and the other of continuous darkness, as at the North Pole, and that, though it was not suited to the latter home of the Vedic people, it was retained because it was an established or recognized fact in the language, like the 7 suns or the 7 horses of the single sun. The evidence in support of this view will be stated in subsequent videos. It is sufficient to observe in this place that if we interpret the twofold division of the Devayâna and the Pitriyâna in this way, it fully corroborates the statement in the Taittirîya Brâhmana that a year was what a day of the gods. We may also note in this correction that the expression path of the gods occurs even in Parsi scriptures. Thus in Varvinyashi paragraphs 56 and 57, the Pravishis, which correspond to the Pitris in Vedic literature, are said to have shown the sun and the moon the path made by Mazda, the way made by the gods, along which the Pravashis themselves are described as growing. The sun and the moon are again said to have stood for a long time in the same place without moving forward through the darkness of the Devas, the Vedic Asuras or demons of darkness, before the Pravashis showed the path of Mazda to the 2 luminaries. This showed that the path of Mazda commenced, like the Devayâna road, when the sun was set free of the clutches of the demons of darkness. In other words, representing the period of the year when the sun was above the horizon at the place where the ancestors of the Indo-Iranians lived in ancient days. We've seen that the Devayâna, or the path of the gods, is the way along which Sûrya, Agni, and other matrilineal deities are said to travel in the Rig-Veda, and that the Parsi scriptures supplement this information by telling us that the sun stood still before the Pravashis showed to him the path of Mazda, evidently meaning that the Devayâna, or the path of Mazda, was the portion of the year when the sun was above the horizon, after being confined for some time by the powers of darkness. But the correspondence between the Iranian and the Parsi scripture does not stop here. There is strong prejudice connected with the Pitriyâna found in latter Indian literature, and even this as a parallel to the Parsi scriptures. The Hindus consider it inauspicious for a man to die during the Pitriyâna, and the great Mahabharata warrior Bhishma is said to have waited on his deathbed until the sun had passed through the winter solstice, as the Dakshina, which is synonymous with the Pitriyâna, which was then understood to mean the time required by the sun to travel from summer to winter solstice. A number of passages scattered over the whole Upanishad literature support the same view by describing the course of the soul of a man according as he dies during the Devayâna or the Pitriyâna, and exhibiting a marked preference for the fate of the soul of the man dying during the path of the gods, or the Devayâna. All of these passages are found collected in Shankaracharya's Bhashva on Brahman Sutras 4:2, 18-21, wherein Badarayana, anxious to reconcile all these passages, the practical difficulty sure to be experienced if death during the night of the gods was held to be absolutely unmeritorious from a religious point of view, has recorded his opinion that we must not interpret these texts as predicating an uncomfortable future life for any man dying during the Dakshinayana, or the night of the gods. As an alternative, Badarayana therefore adds that these passages may be taken to refer to the yogins, who desire to attain in particular a kind of heaven after death. Whatever we may think of this view, we can, in this attempt, clearly see a distinct consciousness of the existence of a tradition, which, if it did not put an absolute ban on death during the night of the gods, did at any rate clearly disapprove of such occurrence from a religious point of view. If the Pitriyâna originally represented, as stated above, a period of continuous darkness, the tradition can easily and rationally be explained, for as the Pitriyâna then meant uninterrupted night, the funeral ceremonies of anyone dying during the period were deferred till the break of the dawn at the end of the Pitriyâna or the commencement of the Devayâna. Even now death during night is considered inauspicious, and the funeral generally takes place after daybreak. The Parsi scriptures are still more explicit. In the Vendidad Fargs 5, 10, and 8, 4, a question is raised how the worshipper of Mazda should act when a death takes place in a house when summer is past and winter has come. And Ahura Mazda answers, in such cases, a kata, or ditch, should be made in every house, and there the lifeless body should be allowed to lie for 2 nights, or for 3 nights, or for a month long, until the birds begin to fly, and the plants to grow, and the floods to flow, and the wind to dry up the water from off the earth. Considering the fact that a dead body of a worshipper of Mazda is required to be exposed to the sun before it can be consigned to the birds, the only reason for keeping a dead body in the house for a month seems to be that it was a month of darkness. The description of the birds beginning to fly, and floods to flow, and etc., reminds one of the description of the dawn of the Rig-Veda, and it is quite probable that the expressions here denote the same phenomenon as in the Rig-Veda. In fact, they indicate a winter of total darkness during which the corpse is directed to be kept in the house, to be exposed to the sun on the first breaking of dawn after the long night. It will, however, be more convenient to discuss these passages after examining the whole of the Vedic evidence in favor of the Arctic home. I have referred to them here to show the complete correspondence between the Hindu and Parsi scriptures regarding the day and the night of the gods, and their unmistakable polar characteristics indicating the existence of an early home within the Arctic Circle. The same traditions are also found in the literature of other branches of the ancient race beside the Hindu and the Parsis. For instance, Dr. Warren quotes Greek traditions similar to those we've discussed above, regarding the primitive revolution of the sky. Anaximes, we're told, likened the motions of the heaven in early days to the rotating of a man's hat on his head. Another Greek writer is quoted to show that at first the pole star always appeared at zenith. It is also stated on the authority of Anton Kirschenbauer that in the Iliad and Odyssey 2 kinds of days are continually referred to in one of a year's duration, especially when describing the life and exploits of the gods in the other 24 hours. The Night of the Gods has its parallel also in Norse mythology, which mentions the twilight of the gods, denoting by that phrase the time when the reign of Odin and the Aesir would come to an end, not forever, but to be again revived. For we are told that from the dead sun springs a daughter more beautiful than her sire, and mankind starts afresh from the life-raiser and his bride life. If these traditions and statements are correct, they show that the idea of a half-yearly night and day of the gods is not only Indo-Iranian, but also Indo-Germanic, and it must therefore have originated in the original home of the ancients. Comparative mythology, it will be shown in the subsequent chapter, fully supports the view of an Arctic home of the ancient race, and there is nothing surprising if the traditions about a day and night of 6 months are found not only in Vedic and Iranian, but also in Greek and Norse literature. It seems to have been an idea traditionally inherited by all branches of the ancient race, and as it is distinctly polar in character, it is alone enough to establish the existence of an Arctic home. But fortunately for us, our edifice need not be erected on this solitary pillar, as there is ample evidence in Vedic literature which supports this Arctic theory by satisfying almost all polar and circumpolar tests laid down in our previous video. The long revolving dawn is another peculiar characteristic of the North Pole. We shall see in the next video that the Rig-Vedic account of the dawn is intelligible only if we take it as referring to polar dawn.